The sun rose gently over the charming village of St. Mary Mead, its golden light brushing the thatched rooftops and misty lanes with a soft and honeyed glow. The air smelled faintly of lilacs and fresh scones, and a sleepy sort of peace hung over the church spire, the post office, and the modest little cottages that dotted the main lane. It was a perfect English morning, one that promised very little trouble, and yet, as so often happened in St. Mary Mead, trouble had already begun to stir behind one of those well-dusted lace curtains. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, knitting needles gleaming faintly in the morning light, her eyes half on her work and half on the lane outside. She was, as ever, quite alert to everything around her, despite the gentle rhythm of her hands. No gossip or small occurrence in St. Mary Mead ever escaped Miss Marple for long. She had, over the years, learned that evil, or folly, or plain mischief, hid in the most innocent places. Her tea tray sat before her, neat as a sermon, 1 cup of Darjeeling, 1 small jug of milk, 2 lumps of sugar, and a plate of her own marmalade toast. But this morning, she found herself frowning slightly. Her marmalade was not quite right, too sweet she thought, or perhaps too thin. She had been trying to replicate a recipe she'd tasted the previous Sunday at the Women's Institute Fair. A truly divine orange marmalade, with just the right tartness and an undertone of clove. The recipe, made by none other than Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt of Harcourt Hall, had won first prize. Miss Marple had meant to ask for the recipe, but poor Mrs. Harcourt had been in something of a flutter that day, and quite forgotten to bring it to the meeting. That, of course, would have been the end of it, had Mrs. Harcourt not been found dead the following morning. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the quiet swiftness of a spreading stain. The housemaid had found her, in her kitchen of all places, collapsed beside a broken jar of marmalade. A heart attack, people whispered, or perhaps a terrible accident. After all, Mrs. Harcourt was not young, and her health had been delicate. But to Miss Marple, there was something about it that troubled her. A lady of Mrs. Harcourt's fastidious nature did not simply leave glass scattered across the kitchen floor. And why had she been working with marmalade jars at dawn? By 10 o'clock that morning, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Much Benham, hat in hand and brow furrowed. Miss Marple, of course, had already heard the entire story by then, from Mrs. Price Ridley, who had it from the grocer's wife, who in turn had heard it from the Harcourt cook. It seemed that Mrs. Harcourt had been found in her dressing gown, collapsed near the pantry, with a faint trace of something sticky upon her fingertips. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry. Her husband, Colonel Harcourt, claimed to have been asleep upstairs. The cook, Mrs. Sims, said she had found the body when she came down to prepare breakfast. Miss Marple listened, eyes narrowed slightly, as the details trickled through the village. A sudden death, a broken jar, and, most curiously of all, the disappearance of the very recipe Mrs. Harcourt had promised to share. The missing marmalade recipe, as people were already calling it, became the talk of every teacup and church pew in St. Mary Mead. That afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the vicarage. The Reverend Clement, ever fond of her company, greeted her warmly, while his wife Griselda poured out the tea and sighed about the whole tragic affair. "Such a dreadful business, Jane," she said. "Lavinia was the very picture of health last week, though between us, she did overindulge in sweets. Perhaps it was her heart. Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. "Or perhaps something else entirely." Griselda raised a curious brow. "Surely you don't suspect foul play, over a jar of marmalade?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, people have killed for much less." Colonel Harcourt had, by all accounts, been a stern man with a fondness for order, and an unfortunate weakness for whiskey. His late wife, Lavinia, had been his second. His first had died of pneumonia years ago in India. The couple had lived quietly at Harcourt Hall, employing only a small staff: the cook, Mrs. Sims, a housemaid named Elsie, a gardener, Mr. Briggs, and a distant relation who had recently come to stay, Miss Clara Denning, Mrs. Harcourt's niece. The niece was young, perhaps 23, with a rather nervous disposition and a reputation for artistic tendencies. It was said that she and her aunt had quarrelled more than once. There were rumours, too, of a suitor, one Mr. Philip Arkwright, a gentleman of uncertain fortune. Miss Marple filed each piece of gossip carefully away in her mind, like clues in a cupboard. The following morning, the coroner's verdict was announced: heart failure, brought on by exertion. No suspicion of foul play. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the matter might have rested there, had Miss Marple not received a most curious visit. It was from Miss Denning herself. She arrived just after luncheon, pale and trembling, clutching a small handkerchief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice thin and frightened, "I don't know who else to turn to. They all think it was natural, but I don't. I think my aunt was murdered." Miss Marple looked at her quietly over her spectacles. "Murdered, my dear. That is a very serious accusation." "I know. But you must believe me." She'd been frightened for days. She wouldn't say of what, only that someone had been in the pantry. She said she'd found her recipe book moved, pages torn out, and now the marmalade recipe she guarded so carefully is gone. Miss Marple sat back, knitting paused. "Tell me, Miss Denning, why was the recipe so important?" Clara swallowed. It wasn't just marmalade. It was something she'd been experimenting with, an old family formula. She said it had commercial promise. She'd been planning to sell it. There was even talk of a partnership with Mr. Arkwright, though I think my uncle disapproved. "Him," said Miss Marple softly. "So a recipe worth money. That does complicate things." As Miss Denning left, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to her own breakfast table, where a jar of her latest marmalade attempt still glistened. She could almost hear Lavinia Harcourt's voice at the fair, speaking proudly of her secret ingredient. And then, something clicked. The missing recipe, the broken jar, and a death too easily called natural. "Dear me," Miss Marple whispered. "I think I shall have to pay a call on Colonel Harcourt." Harcourt Hall was a grand old house, built of mellowed stone and set back behind iron gates that creaked like gossip when opened. The colonel received Miss Marple with a mixture of courtesy and impatience. He was a tall, broad man with a face weathered by army life and whiskey alike. "Very sorry business, Miss Marple," he said briskly. "Doctor says it was her heart. Poor Lavinia always did fuss about her jams and pickles. Overexerted herself, no doubt." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I dare say, though I must confess I am rather curious about her marmalade recipe. It caused quite a sensation at the fair." The colonel gave a short laugh. "Ah, that! Women and their recipes, eh? She guarded it like a state secret. I never so much as glimpsed the thing." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "And yet it's gone now, I hear." He frowned slightly. "So they say. Probably mislaid. Lavinia was forever writing notes and leaving them in odd places. The girl Clara claims it's missing, but she's a fanciful sort." Miss Marple nodded. "And your staff, were they all at home that morning?" "Of course. Sims the cook was first up, Briggs in the garden, Elsie came down later. All quite ordinary." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "Would you mind if I spoke to them?" The colonel hesitated, then sighed. "If you must, but for heaven's sake, let's not start any talk of murder." The kitchen was warm and smelled faintly of citrus. Mrs. Sims, a stout, motherly woman with capable hands, was polishing the silver when Miss Marple entered. "Terrible thing, ma'am," she said at once. "The poor lady. Such a shock, though between you and me, she'd not been herself lately." "Oh," said Miss Marple. "In what way?" "Nervous, ma'am. Kept checking the pantry, muttering about thieves. Said someone had been tampering with her preserves. I told her it was just the draught, but she wouldn't have it." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the pantry door. "May I see where she fell?" Mrs. Sims led her in. The room was small and orderly, shelves lined with neatly labeled jars, orange quince, gooseberry, lemon curd. One shelf, however, had an empty space. "That's where it happened," said the cook softly. "A jar smashed right there. We cleaned it up, of course. Sticky business." Miss Marple bent to inspect the floor. A faint residue of sugar still shimmered where glass had once lain. Was it her own marmalade? "Oh yes, ma'am. She was bottling a new batch. Said she wanted to test it before sending a sample off to London." "London," Miss Marple murmured. "How very enterprising." As she left the pantry, she caught sight of Elsie, the housemaid, hovering by the doorway. A nervous little thing with fair hair and a guilty air. "You were fond of your mistress?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Elsie bit her lip. "Oh yes, ma'am. She was good to me mostly, though she did have her tempers. And the colonel, well, he could be sharp." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You mean he and Mrs. Harcourt quarrelled?" "Oh, I wouldn't say quarrelled, ma'am. Not proper. But she did accuse him once of meddling in her kitchen. Said he'd been looking through her jars. He laughed it off, but she didn't like it." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "And you? Did you notice anything odd that morning?" Elsie hesitated. "Only the smell, ma'am." "The smell?" "Yes. When I came down after Mrs. Sims, there was a strange bitter scent in the air. Not quite oranges, not quite medicine. It made my throat itch." "Heem," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. That is most interesting. Outside, in the garden, she found Mr. Briggs pruning roses with grim determination. Shame about the mistress, he said. Didn't deserve it. Poor lady. You'd known her long? Asked Miss Marple. 10 years, ma'am. A good sort, though she had notions. Always fiddling with them preserves. Said she'd found a way to make 'em last twice as long. That's science for you. And you saw no one about that morning? He shook his head. Only the colonel, just after 6, out walking the grounds. Said he couldn't sleep. Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, walking slowly down the lane, thoughts turning over like quiet machinery. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves. A secret recipe. A quarreled marriage, a niece in need of money, and a smell, bitter and sharp, like medicine, back home. She brewed herself another pot of tea and reached for her own jar of marmalade. A small taste brought a faint tang of bitterness to her tongue. She frowned, went to her cupboard, and fetched a small bottle of tonic. She dipped a spoon, sniffed, and nodded slowly. Of course, she murmured, salicylates. The next morning, she called upon Inspector Craddock. Inspector Craddock, though fond of Miss Marple, had long ago learned to brace himself when she appeared at the station. Her quiet, bird-like manner always heralded complications. You think it's murder then? He said, frowning. Over marmalade. I do indeed, said Miss Marple serenely, though not for the reasons one might imagine. She explained her observations, the bitterness, the missing recipe, the frightened niece. Craddock listened, half incredulous. So you think someone poisoned her marmalade? Not precisely, said Miss Marple. I think Mrs. Harcourt accidentally ingested a preparation intended to mimic the flavor of her special recipe, one that had been tampered with. Craddock blinked. You mean someone swapped her ingredients? Exactly. Salicylates, Inspector. Found in certain tonics, but also in compounds used to preserve fruit. In excess, they can stop the heart. Craddock leaned back. All right, let's suppose you're right. Who benefits? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That, my dear Inspector, is what we must discover. Over the next days, the village hummed with gossip. Clara Denning, pale and trembling, had packed her bags to leave, only to be stopped by the colonel, who declared she must remain until Lavinia's estate was settled. Tension simmered in the great house like a covered pot. Then came the twist. A note was found in Mrs. Harcourt's writing desk, half burned, but legible enough to send ripples through the village. If anything should happen to me, it will be because of the marmalade. The colonel raged that it was nonsense. The staff whispered otherwise. Inspector Craddock reopened his inquiry. Miss Marple returned quietly to Harcourt Hall, under the pretext of bringing scones. As she chatted with Mrs. Sims, her eyes wandered to a small glass bottle on the shelf, labeled preserving essence. Ah, said Miss Marple lightly. Mrs. Harcourt's special flavoring. Mrs. Sims nodded. She always added a drop or two to the mix. Said it gave the peel a sparkle. Miss Marple picked it up, sniffed it gently, and her expression changed. The scent was unmistakable. Wintergreen. Later, she visited Clara, who was sketching in the garden. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, I must ask, were you aware your aunt was using a tonic in her cooking? Clara's eyes widened. A tonic? No, she was very particular about ingredients. And yet someone placed it there. Someone who knew she tested each batch herself. Clara's lips trembled. You don't think? It wasn't Uncle Henry. I think, said Miss Marple, your uncle is many things, but subtle is not one of them. They were interrupted then by Mr. Arkwright, arriving in his motor car. He was a handsome man, sleekly dressed, with a salesman's smile. Miss Marple observed the faint scent of wintergreen as he shook her hand. Ah, Miss Marple, he said smoothly, terrible loss, this business. I was just helping Clara with some of the estate matters. Mrs. Harcourt and I were to launch her marmalade commercially, you know. A terrible setback, indeed, said Miss Marple mildly. And how did you come by such an interest in preserves, Mr. Arkwright? He smiled. Opportunity, Miss Marple. There's always a market for something sweet. Miss Marple watched him drive away, her mind ticking quietly. Sweet, indeed, but with a bitter aftertaste. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, reviewing every detail in her notebook. 5 suspects remained: Colonel Harcourt, the impatient husband Clara Denning, the frightened niece Mr. Arkwright, the ambitious suitor Mrs. Sims, the loyal cook Elsie, the nervous maid. Each had means and motive in theory. Yet only one, Miss Marple knew, understood enough chemistry to use salicylates, and had something to gain from the disappearance of that recipe. The next morning she invited Inspector Craddock to tea. "I believe," she said, "that the death of Mrs. Harcourt was not spontaneous, nor was it premeditated murder in the usual sense. It was sabotage." Craddock blinked. "Sabotage? Yes. Someone tampered with the ingredients of her preserves, perhaps hoping to spoil them, or to drive her to abandon her secret recipe. They did not mean to kill her, but the compound used was lethal." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting an accident caused by malice?" "Precisely, and there is only one person who had both access and motive: Mr. Philip Arkwright." That afternoon, Miss Marple asked the Colonel to gather everyone in the drawing-room. "I think," she said sweetly, "that we should clear up this unfortunate business once and for all." The household assembled, the Colonel scowling, Clara pale, the servants anxious, and Mr. Arkwright standing with affected ease. Miss Marple began gently. "Mrs. Harcourt's marmalade was famous, not just for its taste but for its unusual longevity. She had devised a formula, a commercial prospect, as Mr. Arkwright well knew." Arkwright smiled thinly. "I did, yes. She trusted me." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "but when she hesitated to sign your partnership papers, you decided to frighten her. You tampered with her preserving essence, adding wintergreen oil to spoil her batch." He stiffened. "Preposterous." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not at all. You used the same scent in your hair tonic. When Mrs. Harcourt tasted her batch, she consumed enough methyl salicylate to stop her heart." A week later, the village had returned, outwardly, to its tranquil rhythm. The church bell tolled, gossip fluttered like sparrows around the grocer's, and the scent of new bread drifted from Mrs. Hartnell's bakery. Yet in every drawing-room, whispers lingered about the Marmalade murder. Miss Marple, however, was contentedly seated in her garden, a pot of tea by her side and a fresh jar of marmalade glistening in the sun. The recipe, she admitted privately, was not hers at all. Clara Denning had brought her a jar as a thank you. It was exquisite, delicate, balanced, and just the right hint of bitterness. The vicar's wife, Griselda, came to call that afternoon, her usual air of good-natured curiosity quite undimmed.
"My dear Jane, the whole village is positively aflutter."
"Imagine, a man killed a woman over marmalade." Miss Marple poured the tea with serene precision. "Not quite killed her over marmalade, dear. More through it. And it wasn't malice, exactly, more the natural consequence of avarice and carelessness. You'd be surprised how often the two travel hand in hand." Griselda laughed. "Oh, Jane, you make even murder sound like a sermon." Miss Marple smiled, eyes twinkling. "It's only that human nature never really changes, whether it's a teacup, a will, or a recipe. People always imagine they can conceal their little deceits, but the truth, like a stubborn fruit peel, always finds its way to the surface." Griselda chuckled. "And the Colonel, how is he managing?" "Much improved, I think. He's taken a kindly interest in Clara's future. She intends to start a small preserve company, you know. Lavinia's Legacy, such a sweet name." "How lovely," said Griselda. "Though I do hope no one else dies over marmalade." "Let us hope not," said Miss Marple, her needles resuming their gentle click. "But I do think Mrs. Harcourt would be quite pleased." Several weeks later, on a soft autumn morning, Miss Marple received a small package in the post. It contained a jar of golden marmalade tied with a white ribbon, and a note written in Clara Denning's delicate hand, "To Miss Marple, for showing me that sweetness is best tempered with a touch of truth. With love and eternal gratitude, Clara." Miss Marple smiled as she placed the jar upon her breakfast tray. Outside, St. Mary Mead stirred to life, the milkman clinking bottles, the church bell calling for matins, and Mrs. Price, Ridley already telling Mrs. Hartnell that she'd always suspected something strange about that marmalade. Miss Marple spread a generous spoonful upon her toast, savored the sharp sweetness, and looked out over the rose garden. The world, she reflected, was much like marmalade, bitter and sweet, simple and complex, all at once. And with that, she returned to her knitting, the morning sunlight catching the silver in her hair as she murmured softly to herself, "Really, one learns so much about human nature from the making of preserves." The clock chimed, the tea steamed, and the quiet peace of St. Mary Mead settled once more. At least until the next curious case found its way to Miss Marple's door.